Barely, you just started to comment about ordaining in old age, and it was similar. But as soon as you had started that topic, that you follow it.
So it's very common.
With me.
Marud is an example of that, as one who was ordained when he was young, and now he's ordained in his retirement years.
Mm-hmm.
If a man has his wife to die, generally in America, when a man outlives his wife, he's going to die within a year or so. The statistics prove it. That's not true in Thailand, because generally when a man's wife dies when he's old, he'll ordain as a monk. And he'll ordain at the same temple he's been going to all of these years. He already knows all the monks there. In fact, he may have been on the board of directors of the temple. And so ordaining in old age is very, very common in Thailand. I would say possibly as many as half the old men.
I mean, my default.
We've lost our signal, frozen again.
I hear you again.
Oh, okay. Yes, your signal must not be very good.
And that is definitely my plan. If my wife precedes me in death, maybe I'll turn off my video if that'll help. If my wife precedes me in death, my plan would certainly be just to go to the monastery that I regularly go to and ordain. Because if she's not around, I don't need to be in the lay life. I don't see a point in it.
You know, the issue about sexuality and the fact that there's a lot of evidence. One of them is that having sexual intercourse is a parajika. That's enough to get that conversation started about why the Buddha was so anti-sex. And I would say that it had to do with a lot of cultural things that existed at the time that don't exist now. And therefore, that the whole idea of sexuality can be revisited. The first thing to look at is that Buddha's mother died in childbirth. That should have had an enormous impact upon any kid about sexuality. The fact that it was dangerous, that moms die from the stuff.
Yeah.
I think that there was also a lot of cultural stuff with it, and that I believe that there was a lot of cultural stuff with it because the Brahmins were very, very particular about Brahmins marrying Brahmins to keep Brahmanism pure, because the whole existence of the Brahmins had to do with, we are born Brahmin because we're better than you are, that you're not a Brahmin because you were bad in the past. With that mentality of that Brahmins can only marry Brahmins puts an extra pressure on all of society, extra suffering that doesn't need to be there. And so I think that the Buddha was, let's say, influenced by his own situation as well as the cultural situation on top of the physical realities. The physical reality is that sexuality has great gratification to it because of our genes. that we are sexual because that's part of the nature, that we're driven to it. Now, in our culture, if you were raised in a culture not that separated boys from girls, nor a culture that intermixed them, and by having schools, you see, you've got to kind of make a choice. But by not making any choice at all, and not drawing distinctions with the children, just like little kids are not racist. A 3-year-old black and a 3-year-old white can play together easy. By the time they're 6, maybe not so. By the time they're 10, no way. By the time they're 16, they're killing each other. Why is that? Because the society is adding lies and stupidities and ignorances. And so our society makes us more sexual than we need to be because of the influences. One of them is girls dressing. Dress codes create sexuality. If the entire population of the world ran around naked, we wouldn't be in northern climates much. But we wouldn't have so much trouble with sexuality. Sexuality is caused by clothing. Look, for instance, how hung up Islam is on sex. How hung up are they? Burqa hung up. That's how hung up they are. And so going from one century of overly dressing women to the next century of underdressing women, while knowing men are visually oriented, while women are not visually oriented. In other words, cheesecake is big business, strip bars, etc. Beefcake is not. Old women collecting in big groups of people in a bar while young men, scantily clad, dancing and doing lap dances is very rare. There's probably no more than 10 of such places on the planet Earth at any one particular time. Only big cities. Why is that? Because women are not visually stimulated the way that men are. And therefore, dress codes is intended for stimulation. If the dress codes were not stimulating sexuality, we wouldn't be nearly as hung up about it.
I mean, that's the same reason why tons of guys, and by tons of guys, I mean virtually all guys who have access to the internet, look at porn, while at the same time most women don't. Not to say that there are no women who watch porn or enjoy it, but there's a difference in its appeal. Exactly.
That's another one. Not just beefcake and cheesecake bars, but porn on the internet. I hadn't thought about that because whenever I find any downloads containing porn, I immediately delete them without thought. Partly because I don't want them on my computer for my daughter to find.
If you're going to look at porn, I think it's best just to keep it on the internet and not on your computer.
Well, in that regard, I've got no reason. The only reason I'm downloading the file is because it's pretending to be something that it's not.
Yes. Yes, and if you got porn when you weren't intending to get porn, you definitely want to get rid of that file.
Yeah. And also there's the age factor. In early life, little boys don't think about sex or sexuality at all. Then it starts to go big, and then it gets wild, and it stays wild for a long time, and then it goes through some dips and valleys. We eventually have a midlife crisis. But in old age, let us say old age up until a few years ago when Viagra came in to change things, but in old age, sexuality wanes, and thoughts of sexuality wane. And even if we have thoughts about a particular girl or woman that we see, we don't have those thoughts with the possibility I want her because I've got a chance. But rather we see her in the sense of I like her, but I know I don't have a chance at all. And if I had a chance, I still couldn't get it up. But I have done a bit of changing like that. But the point is that in old age, we naturally give up on sexuality. The sexuality is for the young. And old men who refuse to give it up have a lot of suffering in their life. It's really free to be free from sexuality, to be free from wanting things that we don't need and can't have. One of my students, in fact, mentioned, and I don't think it was you, but someone mentioned that there was a conversation sometime in public that got recorded between Ajahn Samedho and Ajahn Chah. And Ajahn Chah asked Samedho about the ceremonies or events that they were having in the sense of, do you like what you see? And Samedho's answer was, I like it, but I don't want her.
I just heard that for the first time 2 days ago, listening to a talk on dependent origination, and the version that I heard was that Ajahn Chah, this was back when Samedho was kind of the only Western monk, and Ajahn Chah decided, for his reasons of his own, to have him come and sit beside him as the junior monk during a several hour-long discussion with a large group of nursing students.
Uh-huh.
So it was a gathering of, 70 some odd young women, and then afterwards he turned to Samedho after the women had left and said, well, what did that do to you, Samedho? Because, he's in his 30s. And that's when he said, Chom, Dhammarato. I like it, but I'm not going to take it.
Very good, very good. So you've heard the same story exactly from a different source.
I love the wording, and apparently Ajahn Chah loved it so much that he brought it up as a topic for Dhamma talks for several weeks afterwards, and really kind of rejoiced in that bit of wisdom. And I had heard that, and I was like, Ajahn Samedho knows what's up. Like, that's
yes,
it's a very wise statement. And
well, that's how we need to look at it, is to recognize that there is.
I can practice.
Pardon?
I'm not saying that I can practice according to that statement, but I do think that it's something to work at.
Well, you're taking a timeline. Always stop with the timeline ideas and look at it in the here now. Okay. That every time that happens in the here now. So, if you're aware that you like something and you want it, but that you can see that happening, you can change that. I like it, but I don't want it. And that always happens in the here now. And not only that, but in the here now, by doing that, it starts to develop a skill. And so that skill will be available at another time, but that time is also going to be just a here now. Another time to practice.
With regard to sexuality, that I would really like to kind of improve on. And for the most part, I've kind of left it separate. So, as anyone who is any young man in their 20s will have a very similar story to mine. But at some point when I was a teenager, I discovered porn. And porn is just the coolest thing. Not cool in the sense of, showing off to your friends, but as someone who's going through all sorts of crazy hormones, suddenly discovering something that pushes that and releases sexual energy is just something incredible and obviously quite addicting. And growing up in a Christian environment, that became, I think I developed very harmful attitudes about it. And so for the most part, I've kind of just left porn. Mostly I have not worked with it in regards to Dharma practice, simply because when I have it, I start provoking old, really bad conditioning that I received from society. And so I've kind of said, no, that needs to wait. That's not something that I can work on. Just because that heavily, pushing and resisting it, often, even just that language, it becomes a sort of an internal struggle, a fight, and there's all sorts of guilt and shame and other things that are tied up into it that I have to confess my power of sati is not fast enough to keep up with the flood of everything that goes in.
There's something that happens with guys, and that is, it's almost like every addiction. When you first start doing it, we get a hit of dopamine.
Yeah.
And we like that. We see those body parts and we say, oh, I like that. Or we don't even say it, we just like it.
Yes.
And because of that, we like that feeling of the liking. And so we want more of it. And what happens with porn, they have found, is exactly the same thing that happens with chemicals or drugs or whatever. And that is that the more porn that the boy watches, then the more porn he needs in order to get that high. And that if he only watches porn occasionally, then he can get that high quickly, let us say occasionally once a week or so. But if he starts watching it every day, then he might get that for a little while every day, that feeling, but pretty soon he's going to go a whole day, perhaps watching porn for 2 hours, and it becomes boring to him. Or he's not getting the feelings out of it that he got. And there's two reasons for that. And one of them is that dopamine actually starts to destroy the receptors. So that even though the body is creating, or the brain is creating the dopamine, it doesn't have the effect that it used to because the dopamine receptors are getting killed. And that the way that it works then is that if the dopamine receptors can get rebuilt over a period of time, then when the boy goes back to see that porn again, he can get that good feeling. Mm-hmm. But it takes a while for those receptors to get rebuilt. And when we flood ourselves with the dopamine, then we destroy a lot of receptors that take some time to get rebuilt. And so this is what causes the addiction, is the feelings that we used to get. We don't get those feelings anymore, but we want them and we demand them, so we do more and more and more porn with less and less and less benefit. That happens with heroin also.
Yeah.
It can happen actually to anything that we become addicted to. The quality of the addiction is that doing it more and more and more doesn't give the same benefit that it did when it was new. And that's the danger. That's what causes habits. But if you think about it, many things happen that way. The kind of toys that we had when we were kids, when we get that new toy, we just go gaga over it, and then we play with it, and we play with it, and then we get bored with it. In fact, the same thing happened to you when you were a monk, that you experienced boredom. And when you were telling that story, it reminded me of myself also, that, there was a time when I was at the back of Wat Suan Mok, getting bored, feeling bored, wanting to go home, wanting to quit, thinking that I knew what a home was, etc. But then it dawned upon me that what was really going on was that I wasn't practicing properly. If I had been practicing properly, then I would have been enjoying what I was doing, and I had gotten bored because I wasn't practicing properly. And that boredom is in fact nothing but a hindrance, and it's the hindrance of restlessness. We think of boredom as boredom in the sense of low energy because of low stimulation. But really what boredom really is it's restless. So imagine that you're in a business meeting or something like that, or listening to a boring speaker or whatever, and we say we're bored, but really what we want is a change of scenery. You want something new.
Yes. Not
Okay.
satisfied with what's around
Yeah,
us.
I'm not satisfied with what things are happening right now, which means that the mind has gotten restless. That's a hindrance. And when I recognize it all, that my boredom is merely a hindrance. And that's all it is, and it's momentary. The boredom doesn't last a long time, it only lasts a moment. But we think that we're bored all the time because we keep experiencing those boring moments one after another. Sort of like the movie, when we think that the movie is playing all the time, where in fact half the time the light has been turned off so that the frame can move from one to the next, and then they turn the light back on. But the audience thinks that the movie has been playing the whole time. So an hour-long movie, they think the movie is an hour long. Oh no, the movie's not an hour long. The movie's only 30 minutes. The rest of the time you were sitting in darkness, and you didn't even know it. So, if that's the way that boredom works, that it comes and it goes, then the way to take care of it is by seeing it when it comes up. So you can have a thought, I'm bored, and then 5 minutes later you can have another thought, I'm bored, and you think that you were bored for the whole 5 minutes. And that wasn't the case. But by seeing what boredom is as it arises, we can say, oh, it's arising because the mind has now taken on a hindrance. But we also know that no matter how obstructed the mind is with hindrances, those things can be cleaned out. You probably didn't know that when you were a monk, when you did that. That boredom can be chased right out of the mind.
Well, to be clear, I never did ordain because I got sick before I finished the process.
Ah,
so
okay. Same thing.
I spent 2 months sick at home instead of there. So that was purely just fear of getting bored. Although I can attest to the whole cycle of boredom and practicing wrongly. The reason I was concerned about that is because I'd seen it on short retreats that I'll take at the monastery. Right? So when I go to the Wat and for a few days, and I think now I could probably manage it much, much better than I could a year ago. But that definitely was a challenge because I didn't even realize that boredom was just a sign of practicing wrong. Then he said, man, I don't know what to do about this. I am so bored and there's nothing to do here.
Uh-huh. Well, that's the whole point of a retreat, you see. Going into the retreats, whether they're ordained or not, but going into these organized retreats, no matter who the teacher is, or what the lineage is, or whether it's a noble or an ordinary retreat, the one thing that they all have in common is to take away sensory input from the student so that the student has to deal with their own mind. And so they request that the students don't take cell phones, and they don't take the computers, and they don't write, and they don't read, and they don't have TV. They don't have entertainment stuff. And by doing so, that puts the student either to go nuts, as if they were in solitary confinement like in jail, or to practice correctly. Why it is that so many students would prefer to be in prison than practice correctly, I don't know. But so boredom is something that comes up, and that the students need to be warned that the people who are running the retreat are not causing your suffering. You're causing your suffering. That you brought your suffering in here with you in your mind. That we've done nothing to create any suffering for you. That you're doing all of the suffering on your own. And that, in fact, that's part of the reason for having the retreat, is for you to get the insight into the fact that you're creating all of your own suffering here. And that that lesson is not always well learned. My good friend Dad, who works, he's actually the logistics manager for the big retreat center in California at the Goenka Center. And one of the things that he knows is that the average student who takes a Goenka course, when they take a second course, everybody who fills out or does a Goenka retreat has to fill out an application form. So they computerize these application forms, and what they have found is the long time between retreats. That if a student takes a lot of retreats, then he can take them often. But the first time that a student takes a retreat is normally about 7 years before they take another retreat.
Wow.
Why is that? It's because they didn't get out of that retreat what they intended to get out of it, that they got a lot of suffering instead.
I mean, getting a lot of suffering on retreat is good.
No. Becoming wise to the suffering is good.
Yes. Well,
but what they do, instead of getting wise to their suffering, they just sit there and endure it and wish the course was over, thinking that my suffering comes from this course, and I'll be out of suffering when I leave the course.
Right, that is wrong. But having lots of suffering arise and knowing what to do about it while on retreat is optimal, wouldn't you say?
Yes, and it's very simple.
Perfect position to work with it.
Right. But what do we do when we find ourselves bored? Never mind, start again. I mean, very easy things to do, but it's hard to remember. Just like in Washington, they have the cartoon drawing that says the picture is a swamp, a pond. The guy's standing in the middle of it, and he's surrounded by alligators. And the caption is, when you're up to your hips in alligators, it's hard to remember your original intention was to drain the swamp. Okay, well, that actually happens in retreats to people, to where the alligators come from their own mind. They're not Washington, D.C. swamp alligators. They're mental alligators. So our original intention by taking a retreat is to drain the swamp of the mind. And what we wind up with is dealing with all the alligators. And what are the alligators? Greed, ill will, delusion, boredom, restlessness, doubt, wanting things we don't have. Oh, wait a minute, I'm listing off the hindrances.
Well, and if you don't practice correctly dealing with all of those in the non-wise way is very tiring.
Yes, it is, and it's filled with blame, and the people are in a position of being a victim. Very rarely do you see a whole bunch of Buddhas walking around. You see a bunch of slow-moving, miserable victims. And how can we talk them out of it? You don't have to be a victim. Just because you've been a victim doesn't mean right now you have to be one. And so, but all of this plays back to this idea of ambition. People take a retreat because they have ambitions. And all they find is the suffering. I think that should have a t-shirt. The t-shirt says, I took this meditation retreat to find myself, and all I found was suffering. or something like that. I took this retreat in order to become peaceful, and all I found was an internal war.
All I got was stiff legs and a sore butt.
Yes, that's also true. But bodily posture and pain from sitting positions, I think first off, the postures that we take are not so important anyway. But because of the tradition of the sitting postures, those sitting postures, if you maintain them for too long a period of time, can cause the body fatigue. So you stay in those postures a short time. But the students think, oh, well, I've got to, because the meditation retreat period lasts for 45 minutes, I've got to sit like this for 45 minutes. But even at Wat Suan Mok, they teach the students, no, if you've got bodily pain, you should stand up. You should walk around. You should take a break from that. The intention is not to teach the body something like you would in yoga or a musical class. That this is really nothing but a mental exercise. That we can use the body to help us with mental exercises, but just sitting in pain is not an advantage. And I think that as part of that reason is why it's so long for students to take a second retreat, is because they're practicing wrong. Based upon all of their ideas about how they should practice. And so if that's the case then you can imagine how it's going to be like when the student gets to the point of having to really deal with real issues like ambition, wanting things. And when I say wanting things, I'm not talking about immediate wanting like I'm hungry and I want some food. But ambition is the long-term stuff that is identification of who am I and that kind of thing. So this needs to be looked at in the sense of if I want something, then I'm a victim. That if I have what I need now already, then I am a winner. And so coming out of ambition into satisfaction with the way things are is part of that exercise. And when young meditation students have families who want them to, they don't care whether the student practices meditation at all, but they want their son to continue to be ambitious. And that causes its own kind of problem. I'm glad that you, at this point, don't have that, but some students do. They have to deal with the world, and that world wants them to stay in the world and not build your own.
Yes.
But the better way to do it is to recognize that the world that's built for me from society is not the best world for me. It's full of suffering. And that I can build a world that's, for my own mind, that is free from suffering. This is what we mean by the unification of the mind, is one who is no longer torn between ambition and the Dhamma, that we follow the Dhamma without the ambition. And as you can tell, a lot of students have big trouble with that, making that transition. You were lucky you were able to come through that. Not completely finished with it. You may, in fact, have a bad patch or two in the future, but
For sure.
the likelihood of you having a really major life crisis over it the way that some dudes do, you don't have to.
Like I said, I think I still have there's a lot of work to do in those realms, but I feel like I'm partway down the journey. And, by the time it gets to the point that being all the way down that journey is the right place to be at that time.
That's the way of looking at it, exactly. A good way of talking about it is that when students are making progress, if they're dissatisfied with the progress and want more progress, they're not making progress. But if the students are satisfied with their progress, then that's real progress.
I definitely feel very satisfied, which is not something I could say before. I feel like before there was always a sense of dissatisfaction with progress or the state of meditation, how much I understood, and so on and so forth. And now I can say, I'm quite satisfied.
Isn't that marvelous? Isn't that wonderful? That you can actually be satisfied with the way things are. If we can become satisfied, I think that in fact is one of the things that helps to eliminate the that wanting, that ambition. That if we can practice satisfaction, that will help mollify that ambition, so that when it does arise, it's not so painful. It's not such an identification with the self. If I'm not ambitious, what's to become of me kind of thoughts are no longer relevant. Because if that thought does come, what's to come of me if I lose my ambition? The answer is, I can sit right here and smile at it. It reminds me of an old joke. I think it came from my dad. My dad had the joke of work. I'm not afraid of work. Well, I can lay down beside it and take a nap. You get the point of that, right? That I'm not afraid of work. I'm just not going to do any of it. I'm not afraid of it. I'm going to lay down and take a nap instead. That's where we recognize that all ambitious is painful. It makes us work. It keeps us a slave. In fact, this is part of those 5 things that the Buddha talks about. Is like the being free from hindrances is like being sick and getting well, being in jail and getting free, or being a servant to someone and then getting freedom. Actually, that taskmaster that forces us to be servants is our ambition. The ambition is the boss. It tells us what we've got to do. If we tell that ambition, oh no, I'm not your underling, I'm not your slave, I'm not your serf, I am not going to do what my ambition tells me to do. I'm going to sit here and take a nap instead.
You know what? A lot of our discussion today reminds me of. I really like Gautami Sutta. So this is.
Say the name again.
It's well, I think it goes under 2 names. So there's the Sankita Sutta, as well as Gautami. So Gautami is the Buddhist. I don't know what to call her. The lady who took over after his mom died, right? His aunt, I think she is.
His aunt.
She goes.
Who was Ananda's mother.
And she is at this point she's a nun, and she goes to the Buddha and says, I want to go off and be on my own and go to seclusion and practice. Can you give me a abbreviated teaching that I can take with me? And so he gives her the 8-point Dhamma Vinaya. And he says, you can summarize the whole
Your screen froze up again.
I hear you now.
Yeah,
here we go. I just found it in my little collection of suttas. It's number 53 in the Book of Eights. And the 8 points, it starts out with, not being ambitious. And the Dhamma Vinaya is for separation and not for accumulation, and for wanting little and so on, being satisfied. And it ends up, needing very little to be taken care of. And, I think it's interesting that's kind of his summary of, here, you want a summary of the Dhamma Vinaya? here it is, and it all is the sort of things that you're talking about. And I think that that's an important point, that it's easy to kind of overlook. That's the way that Buddhism's up, is kind of being as a non-monastic path of just meditating, that missing out that even if you aren't a monastic, that it, in a very real mental way, you're going to have to go through all of these things as a part of the path, and that that's not optional. The physical surroundings, whether you are a layman or a monk, those are optional, but the mental aspect is not. You can be a very attached, needy, unsatisfied monk, and you can be a completely unattached, free from needs and desires, except for just a very bare minimum as a layman. And to be fair, I'm not saying that you even have to be like me and living in a small house and taking care of
You're breaking up. Turn your video off again.
Here.
No, I didn't hear anything for the past 30 seconds or so. Turn your video off.
Oh, wow.
I think that...
Important.
Yeah, you're still breaking up.
Anyways,
that's better.
I think the summary could be that you have that this is part of. In fact, this is one way of summarizing the Buddha's teachings. There are lots of different short ways of summarizing, but here's one that summarizes it all. And you don't need 227 Vinaya rules and dozens of lists. Here's an 8-fold list that says it all. And but I think that from the self-improvement meditation perspective, if you're going in it from that direction, that it's kind of a difficult thing to encounter and work with.
Oh, thank you, Kitty. I like what you were saying before about it doesn't matter whether you're a monk or not. That what matters is that can you get away from the world? That a lot of monks stay attached to family, or the rules, or whatever that they attach to. And in fact, one of the things that I see that happens with a lot is when the monk is not properly introduced to the noble Dhamma, that they stay caught in the world of the law of karma, and that Paticca Samuppada takes 3 lifetimes, and that the Buddha spent the first watch of the night reviewing 100,000 past lives, that kind of Buddhism.
Yes.
And that it's those kind of monks that are most likely to not gain much benefit from being a monk. It's only when the monk is introduced to the noble Dhamma, the liberating Dhamma, that much value happens. And that's actually more and more in Thailand happening, that Bhikkhu Buddhadasa's group, not just him or his own personal legacy, but during the old days, there was a lot of monks. And I also noticed that when I was in the United States, that I met Sri Lankan, Burmese, Lao, and Khmer monks that were ordinary, and I also met nobles that were in all of those countries.
Yes.
That was a surprise to me. I originally thought that, 1, you had to be Thai, and number 2, you had to know Bhikkhu Buddhadasa before, number 3, you could become noble. That's not the case. that the Noble Dhamma is all over the place. It's in Zen, it's in Chinese Chan, it's certainly in Tibetan Buddhism. And the easiest example of that would be that the Dalai Lama was a student of Bhikkhu Buddhadasa and came to visit him. A lot of people don't know that one. So, yeah, nobility is all over, but it's not available because of situational things. And we're very lucky to have the Noble Dhamma, the Supramundane Dhamma, becoming more and more available to the West.
Oh, yeah.
That's one of the reasons why Ajahn wants me to teach, is because I have the ability to spread this deeper Dhamma that is liberating, that the Buddhist religion on its own is no more liberating than Christianity. But that the real Noble Dhamma, when practiced well, and the main change is a change of attitude from being a victim to being a winner. And the second one is changing the time frame from past and future into be here now. Those are the two major changes that need to be made. The third one, which is the one that we're talking about today, is that change of perspective from ambition to no ambition. Because ambition is the way that we see the future.
Sorry, you cut out there for a second.
Yeah, never mind. Well, I think that we pretty well covered this topic. I'll go back later and look for the Gautami Sutta. You say that's in the Anguttara, and it's number 8, and it's the third sutta in the 8s. Is that what you said? I think we've lost it altogether. So I'm going to hang up now. All right, well, have a good day. We look like we've lost the internet completely.